Okay, well, I want to begin by reading some news, some very disturbing news items that you probably didn't hear on Fox News or on your local news channel. One reporter filed this report. There's a community in Kentucky, and there are some unspeakable crimes happening there. In fact, there are law-abiding citizens who are being attacked, women are being raped, and there's no law enforcement there at all to stop it. It's a terrible place to live, and it's happening in the daytime as well as the evening. It's a community in Kentucky. Another news item that I found recently. In Boston, there is an unprecedented number of people in Boston who are alcoholics. In fact, it's so bad, the problem is so bad there, that even the clergy, the pastors in that area, are alcoholics. One pastor said, I know at least 40 of my colleagues that are always smashed. Another report I heard uncovered, it was a recent poll. It suggested that many of these college students, they say that they are no longer religious. A majority of them are even taunting the fact that they're anti-religious. At Harvard, most students are proud to call themselves atheists. At Yale, only one student attended the one chapel that they had there. One student attended. At Princeton, a huge group of students broke into a nearby Presbyterian church, and they took the pulpit Bible, and they burned it as part of a pagan ritual. At Williams College, a group of students thought it'd be funny to have a mock communion service. Another report that maybe you haven't seen documented the lives of a group of young adults in New York. And this reporter had been studying them for about last year and a half. These young people formed their own anarchist kind of hate group. In fact, the one that this reporter had been studying or listening to and interacting with had 27 members. And many of them were men, but some of them were women. And within a year and a half, 10 were killed. A number of them were arrested for robbing, 9 committed suicide, and there were 7 ladies in this group. All of them became pregnant multiple times, and they didn't know who the fathers were. Now my question is, this is bad, isn't it? This is bad. And I think about our country, will it survive? And the answer, basically, is yes, because all of those reports I gave to you came out of the 1790s, okay? They weren't current events, they came out of the 1790s. And I'm sure your minds just went, oh, more bad news. That's all we watch and see is bad news. No, these things happened in the 1790s. If you think it's bad today, you haven't seen anything yet. And that's what I want to kind of map out for you for just a little bit tonight. How bad it was, and how powerful God moved to change it all, so we can be encouraged. Arguably, I think this country was as bad or even worse today, back in the 1790s. While today, I think we can say that our spiritual climate is, in a religious philosophy, maybe something of pragmatism. Whatever works for you, whatever is pragmatic is my religion. It works for me, that's what I am. Well, in the 1790s, what was developing the philosophy of religion was basically deism, and it was rationalism. Whatever I could conceive in my mind is my religion. And deism, basically, just a simple explanation of deism, is basically that there's a God, a creator God. He's not involved with day-to-day world activities. He gave you all a brain, you better use it, and he wants everybody to be virtuous, and when you die, you either are rewarded or punished. And some didn't even believe that. That's basically deism. It started coming from the Enlightenment time. Well, anyway, there were a lot of people who were turning to deism because it made sense in their thinking, right? And so any of the traditional teachings, the Bible, they threw out. Miracles, they threw out. Jesus, they threw out. I mean, he was just a man. Anything supernatural, they threw out. If your mind couldn't understand like a Trinity, they threw it out. Whatever was rational. So you had like a Jefferson Bible, okay, at that time. Well, Thomas Paine was one of these deists, and he was becoming a celebrity among the young people, and he wrote this book, Age of Reason. And it basically wasn't well thought out. It was a critique of Christianity. And they were publishing it and printing it in France, and they were sending it to the United States, and young people were buying it basically with a penny. And sometimes they were just giving it away. They were flooding the market so that young people were reading this Age of Reason. And there's stories of young people who would buy it, and they'd go into the haymow in the barn and read it behind their parents' back. Maybe like watching pornography or something, or read it like the last, kind of book, like a Harry Potter book or something. I mean, they just dug into that stuff. And of course, there were other men who were deists, and these were all of the champions of the Revolutionary War. So young people looked up to them. You think of Ethan Allen, a Revolutionary War hero, captured Ticonderoga, that fort. He wrote a book called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. And Timothy Dwight said of that book, that was the first anti-Christian book that was written and published in the New World. General Dearborn, you know General Dearborn? Well, he became Jefferson's Secretary of State, or Secretary of War, I should say. And he wrote this. He said, "So long as these temples, the churches, stand, we cannot hope for good governance." Get rid of the church. Get rid of all that superstition. Jefferson himself, of course, spent a lot of time in France, and he often expressed his doubts of God's existence, and he didn't believe in Jesus Christ, of course. So this was being pumped into the young people. Then there were groups of young people in the college, particularly, community, and these groups of young people, college kids, were intrigued with the French Revolution. The French Revolution happened in 1789. And in France, they went through all of France. Any symbol of the cross, anything that smacked Christianity, they just expunged. They went into cemeteries and they chiseled off crosses from tombstones. I mean, they did away with Sunday. I mean, just totally get rid of everything of God that smacked of Christianity. And they wanted to be free from that. Well, the groups that were doing this were called Jacobin groups or clubs, and it was because of where they were formed in France. But these Jacobin clubs were starting to form here in the United States, and of course these Jacobin folks, they wanted to basically, and they did in France, execute a lot of people. A lot of the clergy were beheaded. They took the guillotine and they chopped off a lot of heads, and there was a fear that that was happening and going to happen in the United States, that the guillotine was coming to all the religious leaders and the like, because they wanted to expunge, do away with Christianity and all of that here in the United States. Some of these groups would be so bold as they'd enter into churches. They'd spit, they'd come into a church and they'd see a bunch of people, they'd spit on people, they'd cause all sorts of ruckus in the churches, at least the churches that were meeting. I mean, it was a terrible time, and they didn't care. These college campuses basically were also becoming the forerunners of that 1978 movie Animal House, you know? They had their own Animal House there. I mean, they were gambling, they were binge drinking, they were carousing in these college campuses. And listen to some of the stats, and it's really sobering, some of these things. Williams College, for example, held a mock communion in part to make fun of the only underclassman, the only one who was a member of a church. And they did that to mock him and and to abuse him. Or Harvard and Dartmouth and Columbia. Nearly all of these students were atheists. At least that's what they claimed to be. In fact, in Columbia, on a cold February night, the students met to read together the works of Thomas Paine, and they sang French Revolution songs, basically dreaming of another revolution in the United States. This follows our own revolution, of course. Yale University, before Timothy Dwight became the president in 1795, and Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, only one student went to chapel, and in that first academic year that Timothy Dwight was president, and there was only one professing Christian in the sophomore class, only one in the junior class, and only 8 in the senior class who claimed to be, admitted to be members of a church. That was the learned academic folks that were going to become your doctors and so forth, lawyers in the United States. Well, going on in Kentucky, of all places, west of New England, there was such lawlessness that the honest people were robbed, women were raped in broad daylight, particularly in a place called Rogues Harbor. And there in Kentucky and other places, a lot of criminals that were running away from Europe came, and they were hiding out in these areas. And they took advantage of people, they robbed, they did all sorts of things. Congress received a report in 1800 about this area and asked, why is it so lawless? The report came back and said, well, there was only one court session, and it took place every 5 years. So no one was being arrested, and no one was being convicted, and so they got away with it all. Alcoholism was so prevalent, especially after the war. You know, war, if you've fought in war, been a part of that, I mean, that does things to you. Well, it did a lot to a lot of these folks. But after the war, we had a population of about 4 million in 1790. And of that 4 million, there were at least 300,000 that were drunkards, or people that basically weren't doing anything, just drinking, didn't work. One pastor from Boston, like I said earlier, claimed that there were at least 40 ministers that could barely stand up, let alone preach on Sunday morning, because they were full of alcohol. And what about the churches then? You think about that. Well, what happened here? Well, in 1776, there were about 1,335,000 Christians or Protestants. Okay, and that was before the war. In 1800, there were only 350,000 Christians left in the country. That's how much it declined. I mean, obviously some people died in the war and so forth, but that's how fast the country went down. Some of the churches in New York and other places were left abandoned after the war. I mean, a lot of those churches in New York, the British used for stables. They did everything they could to mock the church, and they did terrible things to the clergy. Many of these churches didn't have pastors. Some of them had died, some of them just simply gave up. Many people stopped going to church, and they started getting comfortable doing that, just like today after COVID. People not coming back to church, they felt comfortable not going to church. The same thing. Some churches tried to compromise, tried to win people back. They said, yes, that Christianity is, you can't believe in all of that, but let us give you one that you can believe. And so there was a man by the name of Charles Chauncy. He becomes the father of universalism. And he said, you know what? Christianity is unreasonable, and the God of Christianity is too heartless. And so, you know what? You come to my church, you, especially you young people, you come to my church and I'll tell you who God really is. And so he came up with what was called the pudding. It was something he didn't dare share with a lot of people, but eventually it was rolled out toward the end of 1780 or so. And the pudding was basically this, that there's a new way to interpret Scripture. And part of that new way is to look at hell in a different way. Hell isn't forever. It's that one little word that for eternal, needs to be translated in a different way. Hell isn't eternal. You get a different chance. Sounds like someone else in our city that said something very similar to that, right? And he wasn't the first one, okay? Chauncy was the first one who said that. But he said, come on in my church. I'll tell you what you want to hear, and you can believe in God then. You had deism that was preached on the pulpits. Preaching was rationalistic. There was no piety there, no experiential aspect of the Christian faith. It was all head knowledge. It was dry, dusty. Even the Methodist Church, that was very had a lot of fervor in its evangelism. Even in this time, they lost 4,000 people. Well, this country was going down. I could go on and on with all the bad news, what was happening here. But President Washington, he was out of office, but a few years before he died, basically said, I see this country, and I don't think it's going to last. He said that to a friend. I don't think it's going to last. He was afraid of that French Revolution coming in. All the things that were, all the fiber, the fabric of culture was being torn apart, and he didn't think it was going to last. You think of John Adams there, poor old John Adams. There were a lot of people in the election, election of 1800, I think, between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson, a humanist, basically. He did all he could to basically get rid of Christianity in the University of Virginia. And so Christians, the people who were praying, people who were still meeting evangelical, were praying for that election, that Adams would win, and not Jefferson. And sure enough, Jefferson won the election. And now they think, we're really in deep, deep trouble. Who's going to get us out of this? What's going to happen? Well, something remarkable happened. As God's people prayed in desperation, and they all prayed in desperation, not just a group of people like here tonight. Every church that had any kind of evangelical leanings and a heart for God started to pray earnestly, and God poured his Spirit down upon this nation in a way that hasn't been experienced in a long, long time. And because of that, some wonderful things happened. In the course of 5 years, and I won't go through all this, we need to pray too tonight, but in the course of 5 years, a majority of the students graduating from all of these Ivy Leagues, Yale and Harvard, were entering into ministry after this, about 1801, 1802. Yale in 1802, under the direction of Timothy Dwight. 75 of the 230 students were actually converted, and nearly half of them went on to ministry. And over. 7 students formed the first American Foreign Missionary Society in 1812, entering China and India. By 1815, over half of the class at Princeton was going into ministry. By 1827, 17 new seminaries were started by various denominations. All of these kids that were calling themselves Voltaire, Rousseau, and these kids that were basically reading the Age of Reason, going into colleges, just mocking everything that was of the church, of Christianity, were now being converted through this tremendous awakening. And they were being used into ministry. In fact, I think by the 20 years from that point, from 1800, there were in the neighborhood of like 11,000 pastors. And they needed every one of them, because out west there were very few pastors. One pastor for every 10,000 people. It was desperate. The Western Territories, Rogues Harbor. One man returned to Rogues Harbor a few years later after the revival. And he couldn't believe the transformation in that Kentucky area. Taverns were closed. Brothels were no more. He didn't even hear a single coarse conversation. In a matter of just 1 year, 1801, 1802, the Baptists alone added 10,000 people in Kentucky. Churches were full again. People were waiting in line to enter into the church building. People begged pastors to keep on preaching. Now, I've been in ministry for some 32 years as a preaching pastor. I've never had anyone beg me to keep preaching, ever. They applauded when I stopped early, but they never said, go on, go on. But they did. And in 1801 to 1802, Methodists added 40,000 throughout the country in 1 year. 1824, 11,000 active pastors in churches. In a matter of 30 years, church membership went from 365,000, that low part, that low point, went from that to 1 million, almost 2 million in a matter of 30 years after the Second Great Awakening. I forgot to mention about one church, the Lenox Church in Connecticut. And this church had nothing but a sea of gray of people that were left. And a young pastor comes in, just graduates in 1795 or so, and he sees all these older people, and the baptismal font had been dry for 17 years. There was a single young person that ever entered into that church. And after the Second Great Awakening, 1801, 55 young people professed their faith and were baptized in that church in 1 year. Can you imagine that? In 1 year.
Thank you, God.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Entire communities were transformed. Schools, orphanages were started. The plight of the slaves in Africa or in America started to take center stage after this. Within 4 years, 100,000 Bibles were distributed throughout the country. But what happened to those deists? Those French people, or French deist lovers? You know, what happened to them? People who wanted another French Revolution in the United States. What happened? Well, one of the first things that Thomas Jefferson did when he became president is he went and he sent for his old buddy Thomas Paine. You know, the guy that wrote The Age of Reason, that book that all those kids were reading and they're behind their parents' back. He wanted his old buddy to come into the United States. So Jefferson sends a Navy vessel, the Maryland, to go all the way to France to pick this guy up and bring him home as a hero. Well, that was a mistake, because he did that in 1802. And when the newspapers got wind of that, basically they booed him. They booed him off the pier. And here's a quote from the New York Post. It says, basically, "You detested reptile, wherefore hast thou come to add new evils to our growing land? To some wild desert let thy carcass roll." That's how much it changed. The attitude changed because of the Second Great Awakening.
Thank you, God.
It's just amazing. Now, I say this because the Lord brought this awakening in this country. And it started when a remnant of people like ourselves here tonight fervently, urgently, faithfully prayed. And God blessed that. And God's more than able to do it again. More than able. And you think this country is bad? You think that it's impossible? Think again. Think again.
Amen.